threatening the most important digital infrastructure on the planet, plus an environmental disaster. Yemen's Houthis had already destabilized global trade through the Red Sea. Now concerns are shifting to crucial fiber optic cables and the environment, with demands to force Israel into a ceasefire unmet. How much will infrastructure and fragile waterways pay for the assault on Gaza? I'm Einar Tangen. Today's newsmaker is the Red Sea. When Yemen's Houthis first attacked vessels passing through the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, global shipping took a huge hit. The Houthis said all they wanted was a ceasefire in Gaza. Not only was that denied, but the US and the UK attacked Houthi targets in response. Now, not only is global shipping disrupted, but crucial underwater fiber optic cables have been cut. And a UK cargo ship carrying tons of chemical fertilizer was sunk by a Houthi missile. So how much more can the fragile waters of the Red Sea take? And how much will the world have to pay for its destabilization? Here's a look.
A crisis unfolding beneath the waves of the Red Sea, where crucial underwater communications cables have been compromised. In this strategic waterway, 4 out of 14 submarine cables have been severed, forcing short-term fixes. They're owned by global telecoms giants, and they bridge continents, connecting Europe to Asia. 25% of traffic between Asia, especially India and Pakistan, as well as Europe and the Middle East, is being impacted. Underwater cables are the invisible force driving the internet, with many funded by internet giants such as Apple, Google, and Amazon. Damage to these subsea networks can cause widespread internet outages. But what's happening in the Red Sea is not only about internet cables. This ship, struck by Houthi missiles, has now sunk, with 7,000 barrels of oil on board and, even more worryingly, a massive cargo of fertilizer, which could be disastrous for the Red Sea's pristine coral and sea life.
This is going to be a catastrophe. All the creatures will be affected to varying degrees. The chemical contamination will continue for years. Recovering from chemical contamination will be very difficult, especially for Yemen and its neighboring countries with inadequate scientific and technological capabilities.
If the fertilizer escapes the wreck, it will cause a mass algal bloom, while the oil could destroy desalination plants, especially in Saudi Arabia, supplying millions of people with drinking water. And the impact of this crisis will reverberate around the world.
When the environment is polluted, the livelihood of numerous people will be affected. We need broad international cooperation to mitigate the impact of the pollution.
The crisis in the Red Sea is, of course, something we are concerned about, and we are monitoring this closely. 12% of world trade approximately goes through the Suez Canal, about 1/3 of container shipments from China to Europe. So it's clearly something we have to watch.
Between 2015 and 2023, the Houthis watched as an abandoned Yemeni tanker, the FSO Safa, with over 1 million barrels of oil drifted in the Red Sea, before eventually the UN raised $120 million to buy a new ship to unload its cargo. With apparently little thought given to the environmental impact, it's no surprise the Houthis are threatening more attacks.
Our military operations will continue and advance, and we have surprises that our enemies will not expect at all. We don't want to talk about it. We want it to start with actions.
Beyond the cut cables and attacks on ships, it's hard to imagine what other disruption the Houthis have in store. And despite an international effort to stop their attacks, this relatively small, former rebel army is creating global shockwaves and possibly an environmental disaster that could come back to haunt it.
So how much worse can it get for the Red Sea? Well, joining me now to debate that are, from Beijing, political and economic affairs commentator Einar Tangen, from Sana'a, Yemeni journalist Yousef Al Mawry, and from Vienna is Ibrahim Jalal, a Yemeni security, conflict, and defense researcher and co-founding member of the Security Distillery think tank. Thanks all so much for being with me. Yousef, I'm going to start with you in Sanaa because there's a real lack of clarity as to whether the Houthis ever intended to target communication lines. On a Houthi-linked Telegram channel, there was apparently a map showing all the international cables passing through their territory, but there was no explicit threat. Still, though, it led some analysts to say, okay, that's what they're after. So could they have cut these lines? Is it possible?
Well, I think if it's possible, then this would have been a measure that would have been employed and implemented and executed while the Ansar Allah Houthis were being bombarded by the Saudi-led coalition from 2015 all the way until 2021. We're talking about 8 years of war, which witnessed all types of atrocities and aerial campaigns that bombed almost every province of Yemen, and still the Ansar Allah Houthis did not target or make any intent or statements claiming that they would target these fiber optic communication cables that are under the Red Sea. So it's definitely not in the interests of the Ansar Allah Houthis to target these cables. It's one of these sources that claim that or blame the Ansar Allah Houthis is an Israeli media outlet that basically said it is the Ansar Allah Houthis who are targeting these telecommunication streams. And according to the Ansar Allah officials that I spoke with, in fact, according to the Ansar Allah Houthi leader, he made it very clear that there is no plans and no intentions whatsoever in any way, shape, or form to target the fiber optic cables that are flowing through the Red Sea. So it's definitely, again, it's not in their interest. However, I would say it is in the interests of Israel, of the US, and the British government to blame the Ansar Allah Houthis for carrying out this supposed or this alleged attack that supposedly damaged 4 of these optic fiber cables. Right. And the reason I say that is because the US, Israel, and the British government, they're actively engaged in supporting the genocide that has taken place in Palestine. And I can tell you that according to a lot of, the entire region and according to a lot of the Yemeni people, they believe that the Ansar Allah Houthi movement are playing an active role in bringing an end to that genocide by the military operations that they are conducting in the Red Sea. Right. And so these accusations, according to the Ansar Allah Houthis, are aimed at demonizing and undermining these military efforts to end the genocide taking place in Palestine.
Then tell us, Yousef, what are the Houthis actually threatening when they say we have surprises? This is their quote. We have surprises that our enemies will not expect at all.
It's a good question. I actually raised that question to one of the Ansar Allah officials who I interviewed a couple of weeks ago, Mohammed al-Bukhaiti. And the surprises that the Ansar Allah movement, the Houthis, are talking about are military surprises and introducing new weaponry into the battle scene. We're talking about the introduction and the deployment of mini remote-controlled submarines, which the Ansar Allah military, the Houthis, are going to leverage and are going to introduce if the tensions continue to increase and if the US and the British Army continue to attack Yemen. They've made this very clear in a number of statements, public addresses. They made it very clear in, throughout their social media accounts that the most powerful, strongest weapons that is in their possession haven't yet been used, haven't yet been introduced. However, these weapons will be introduced. I can tell you that one of these Ansar Allah officials told me that these submarines have the capability of launching torpedoes from underwater that are able to hit any target that is approaching Yemeni territorial waters. So, and also let's not forget that the Yemeni fighter jets, the Ansar Allah Houthi military, they have in their possession Yemeni fighter jets that they have not yet introduced to the battle scene in the Red Sea and in the Gulf of Aden. So we can also expect that to be part of their newly introduced military arsenal if these attacks continue on Yemen.
Great. I mean, that doesn't bode well for trying to stabilize the region, the Red Sea and its surroundings. Let me turn to Ibrahim, though, because, even if the Houthis, for example, didn't cut these lines deliberately, there's a good chance that they were cut by the anchor of that drifting and now sunken UK ship that was hit by a Houthi missile. So multiple possibilities still lead back to Houthi actions taken in the region. Do they not? It's still possible that even if it wasn't intentional, a direct cut of these lines, that it was the destabilization that the Houthis caused in this conflict that led to the communications cuts.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea, and thank you to your guest for unpacking some of the issues. In terms of the possibility, there are a few possibilities that lead us, to scenarios until an investigation is conducted by a maintenance ship. But so far, if it's the anchor of the ship that actually was targeted, then I was drifting at speed of 9 kilometers per 24 hours or a day, then they, of course, have led into that. And that's just a possibility. The other possibility is that with the introduction of underwater unmanned vessels, which were first deployed and used operationally in February, just a few weeks preceding the news of the cable cuts, then that's also another possibility. But until this is examined, the whole Red Sea escalation now, or even the ship that sunk with fertilizers, including dangerous phosphate materials, that now threatens fisheries and biodiversity and environmental considerations underwater, which will have impacts for at least a large population of 175,000 Yemeni fishermen that affect these sectors. So Yemenis are impacted also by these actions.
Right.
I'm not too sure what, when a ship sinks with its load of dangerous phosphate materials benefits Gaza. But I'm sure
nobody wins, I think, on that front.
It's for Yemenis.
Yeah, let me go back, though, and ask you, Ibrahim, if you actually agree with Yousef saying that the Houthis would have really no interest in cutting these crucial fiber optic lines.
What are the main Houthi objectives of the Red Sea escalation? I think these have to be assessed for us to actually gauge whether they have an active interest or not. One, they've made it to the international headlines. Second, they've demonstrated power and capability to disrupt not only Red Sea traffic, but also force major companies reroute via the Cape of Good Hope. So we've seen the intention to disrupt, and if we look into that, the underwater cable, telecommunication cables basically are just another domain for the Red Sea escalation if they decided to. In December, as you rightly mentioned, we saw the implicit posting of Red Sea and underwater telecommunication infrastructure, which is an implicit signaling, even though there was no clear communication of threat. In that sense, we've seen also multiple denials, but in some instances, I'm not too sure what denials mean when you have an active theater of warfare. And you know that the effects of these are indiscriminate and affect states that do not necessarily actively engage in the atrocities against the Palestinian people.
Yeah. Einar, hold tight for 1 minute. I just need to come back to Yousef for a second, because Yousef, off the back of what Ibrahim was just saying there earlier on, we only just saw the FSO Safar rescued before up to 1 million barrels of oil could have potentially spilled into the Red Sea. Now we have a ship laden with industrial fertilizer sunk after leaving a huge oil slick behind it. Yousef, these are your waters. This is your coastline. I mean, who really wins if it's your backyard suffering all the environmental damage and the economic damage that comes with that?
Well, I think we have to be careful, first of all, in how we structure this argument and this discussion. I think when we look at what's happening on the ground, the Ansar Allah Houthis have been very clear on what their military objectives are. And they've held true to that based on empirical evidence of the attacks that they have carried out. All of the attacks that they have carried out in the Red Sea, in the Gulf of Aden, in the Arabian Sea, have targeted the three entities, the three states which they said that they will target, which is Israel, Israeli-linked ships, American, and also British ships. Now, the operations in the Red Sea, they began with targeting the Israeli-linked ships only. Listen, there's hundreds of ships and shipments that flow through Bab el-Mandeb until today. And the only ships that are being targeted, the only ships that are in danger, are the ones who are engaged in genocide taking place in Palestine, and the ones that are linked to the U.S. and the British military offensives across Yemen. Now we're talking, you mentioned
the Red Sea. The Red Sea as a body of water does not care who owns these ships. Environmentally, these ships are sinking and damaging that body of water, whether they're from the UK or the US, it doesn't matter. Are you not worried about what this could do to Yemenis?
Do you not believe that the American and the British government are to be held responsible for this? Because, as you mentioned,
that's not the question I'm asking, though, unfortunately. I'm just asking personally for you. I mean, this is the tragedy of war, is that it's often lose-lose, both sides. And this is what Yemen will have to face, even if it militarily gives the Houthis an upper hand and serves their cause for what they believe they're fighting for in Gaza, and many would agree with them here. This is about your own land, your own waterways that are so crucial to life in Yemen. If they are damaged, where does that leave Yemenis, who are already among some of the poorest on the planet?
Well, let's not forget that Yemen was subjected to becoming the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. And this was a plague and a coordinated effort by the Saudi-led coalition backed by the US and the British government. So when we're talking about the concerns surrounding the Red Sea and stirring the entire nation into an environmental or humanitarian catastrophe, I think the biggest threat is coming from the West and the countries that are actually engaged in dropping 250,000 bombs on Yemen, and the ones deliberately directed to causing the potential environmental catastrophe of the 1.2 million barrels of oil being spilled into the Red Sea if the Safar oil tanker was, on the precipice of sinking because of the humanitarian blockade imposed by the U.S. and the British Saudi-backed coalition force. So yes, this does affect the Yemenis. Let me be very clear. The Yemenis don't want to see war. The Yemeni people don't want to see these military operations taking place in the Red Sea. But if you take to the streets and you see the millions of protesters taking to the streets every day,
running that footage
every single Friday, their message is
we know where they
these
stand.
tensions can cease to exist if the genocide in Palestine ends.
And their solidarity is impressive. Okay, I'm going to come back to some of the issues you raised there, but let me get to Einar, because Einar, China is really on the receiving end of all this, even though it's had nothing to do with the assault on Gaza. First, tell us what consequences Beijing has had to suffer for this region's destabilization. Is there anything Beijing can do as well, given its kind of more diplomatic relationship with even Iran, for example?
Well, let me answer your second question first. I mean, Iran is an independent nation. They say that while they help the Houthis and support them, they don't necessarily control them. That's something that's up for debate. In terms of how this is hurting China, it hurts China when you have a situation where world trade is impacted. Actually, Chinese ships are able to get through. They're able to send their transponder signals to whoever is attacking, I assume the Houthis. It's not affecting them directly, but indirectly, China suffers when the world suffers. And that's one of the issues that is out there. But, Andrea, let me respond to a couple of points that my colleagues have made. First off, this idea that somehow it's no big deal, that this is somehow just a response to imperialist powers. Well, that's true to a certain extent. The Houthis are not Yemen. They control part of Yemen, but they don't speak for it. They have issues. They have had issues with Saudi Arabia, other countries, UAE. At this point, there has to be some kind of understanding that what the Houthis are doing in furtherance of their issues is hurting the entire world, including people in Yemen. So this idea that somehow it's all justified, yes, I realize. And one very important issue, the world has changed militarily. This idea that you can take a $500 drone packed with explosives and kill an Abrams tank that costs $10 million has upset the military balance, but it hasn't changed the fact that people are dying. And at this juncture, Iran is winning, the Houthis are winning in the sense that they're recognized as responding to the genocide that is being perpetuated on Palestinian people. That's one aspect. But punishing the rest of the world for the actions of a few nations, the U.S., Israel, and their backers, is not acceptable.
Einar, quickly, do you think the Houthis also risk, I mean, okay, let's be honest, the Houthis have been always quite happy to go at it alone. I mean, many say they're Iran-backed, but then you'll hear many other argues the Houthis will do as the Houthis do. They get support from Iran, but they make their own decisions. Still, though, in the context of, larger geopolitics, are they risking angering potential allies with these actions that they might need to call on, in a sense, in the future?
Yes, they are. I mean, the goodwill that they're creating by championing the Palestinian cause could be at risk by, in essence, punishing the world. It's fine for Iran to say that they don't support, they don't control the Houthis, but they are the ones who are arming them. It's just like the U.S. arming Israel. You cannot claim that you're innocent simply because you're not pulling the trigger if you're providing the bullets.
Yeah. Let me ask Ibrahim then, because going back to some of the points that Yousef was making as well about the Houthis themselves, many an analyst has actually accused the Houthis of capitalizing on Gaza to give themselves purpose because they don't actually know how to govern. They only know how to fight. And this gives them a cause to rally around, to get their supporters together, to establish.
Completely agree.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. So, are they eventually, in the long term, though, kind of shooting themselves in the foot?
Thank you. Your guests previously did not answer whether this affects, the livelihood of Yemenis, which it does, obviously. As for the capitalization or weaponization of the Gaza cause, if you've been to Yemen recently and you've heard the opening of roads initiatives, I happened to be in Ma'ib just over a week ago, and the Ma'ib governor had then announced the opening of Ma'ib Sana'a Road. Yemenis on the ground had hoped, to see Houthi goodwill outside be implemented within the country by, easing, the suffering of the people, allowing easier mobility across governorates that reflects for the whole public. And that's very vital for the people. If traveling between two cities or two governorates take over 10 hours when it can be actually between 2 to 3 hours, that's a huge unnecessary suffering that the people would go to. So that takes you to one point. Winning the moral ground at home is equally as, if not even more important than claiming to win the moral ground outside. And that's the biggest challenge today for the Houthis. It is demonstrating credibility of actually addressing the Yemeni daily issues on the ground, be it on the humanitarian level, be it on the payment of salaries, be it even on making credible steps on the peace process. And that's important. And that's similar also for, different actors on the ground. But the Houthis, given the, weaponization of Gaza, but also the international sort of upload of that, detached of a nuanced understanding of internal practices, does deserve, scrutiny.
Okay, I'll let Yousef respond then quickly to the same question and what you heard from Ibrahim there. I mean, is this the Houthis' only another chance for them to do the only thing they know how to do, and that's fight a war, rather than starting to govern the territory they've now claimed?
Well, according to a British Parliament member, the military actions that are being conducted in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden by Yemen's Ansar Allah Houthis are actually in accordance to international law. In fact, he commented that provisions in the Geneva Convention oblige all states to do whatever they can to assist in ending the genocide. And there's also the responsibility to protect doctrine, which was established by the U.S. and the United Nations in 2015. And according to the 3 articles of the responsibility to protect doctrine, it makes it an obligation and a duty for every state that controls a large group of population. It makes it the state's obligation to protect them from massacre, from genocide, and from war crimes. If, according to Article 2, if the state is unable to protect its population from genocide, it becomes the responsibility, the obligation of the international community to step in and bring an end to the massacre, the genocide, and the war crimes by any means necessary. So according to this British parliament member, the Ansar Allah, the Yemeni army, are fulfilling their humanitarian obligation to the international community. This is not what I'm saying. Now, in terms of the internal stability within Yemen, yes, the Yemeni people are not being paid salaries. Yes, unemployment is at an all-time high. Yes, poverty exists across Yemen. Yemen is still the poorest country in the Middle East. But why is it that millions of these poor Yemeni people continue to take to the streets every single week to show solidarity with the Palestinian people? And I can tell you that, according to them, the ones that I spoke with on the ground at these demonstrations, they feel it is a bigger obligation to bring in their salaries. Okay. In fact, one of them told me that they are willing to break the bread that they have left in order to lift the blockade and to bring in food and humanitarian supplies into the people of Gaza, because obviously they are suffering from genocide.
Yousef, I'm going to have to unfortunately interrupt you there, and I have to apologize to Einar because I wanted to get back to you one last time, but we are completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. So I'd like to thank you all, three of my panelists, so much for joining us, and our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.